From Iraq to Afghanistan, over the last quarter of a century, the foreign policy of the United States has very much been defined by efforts at nation building. These missions, grounded in the idea that democratic institutions, free markets, and strong civil society can be engineered into existence, have had mixed results. And now, as the Trump administration is flirting with the idea of being involved in the reconstruction of Gaza, the same questions that have plagued U.S. foreign policy for the last 25 years have arisen once again. Can a foreign power build a nation? And, more importantly, what are the assumptions driving such efforts at nation building? I'm Djene, and you're listening to Talking History. With us to discuss this topic today is Dr. James Ryan. Dr. Ryan is the Executive Director of the Middle East Research and Information Project and an Adjunct Professor of History and International Studies at Rowan University. His writings, especially on the history of Turkey, have appeared in The Washington Post, New Lines magazine, Public Books, and other outlets. He has a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Ryan, welcome to Talking History.
Great to be here with you, Gene.
So I wanted to begin by talking about the ideas and concepts undergirding efforts at nation building, especially these efforts that the United States has been heavily involved in over the last quarter of a century. And one of the key concepts that you and others talk about as the ideology undergirding these nation building efforts is this concept of modernization theory. So to start with, just so we can kind of get a baseline understanding of what we're talking about today, what is modernization theory and how is it connected to this idea of nation building?
Right. So when you hear, I think for the first time, the word nation building, it kind of assumes that, nations are things that are kind of constructed in a way, right? They're put together from an assembly box of pieces that are required in order to, build a nation that's not going to fail, that's going to succeed in some kind of way, right? It's a very social science way of thinking about constructing things in some sense. Modernization theory is, before we had that term nation building, we had or developed modernization theory, which developed out of a lot of social science thinking, political scientists, economists, and sociologists, mainly in the United States and in the West, in the early Cold War period, that more or less put forth an idea that in order to achieve or build a modern society, there were real concrete building blocks that had to be in place first. And it's a long list of things, but included in them were some improvement or some certain level of economic activity, a familiarity, a sort of gradually increased familiarity with democratic modes of governance, a level of sort of sympathetic or empathetic feeling between peoples that an individual might not have come into contact with on an everyday basis. And some of these things were indeed quite, concrete, like physical material things. There's, the economy needed to be at a certain level. The material, structures and buildings and roads and so forth around the country needed to, be developed at a certain level in order to achieve modernization. But some of them, like I mentioned, this like idea of empathy or this idea of sympathetic reasoning, also, it may seem a little less concrete, but they were things that a lot of social scientists and a lot of the people who developed modernization theory in the first place really believed could be measured, through surveys and through interviews and through all kinds of ethnographic data and so on. So, this is a really expansive, field of study and theory that developed in the 1950s and 1960s to really try to identify some, sort of check tests for modernity, right? I think if you come at it from another vantage point, a very slippery and hard to pin down thing. These folks really thought it was something that could be very discreetly and concretely defined. And if you could do that, you could build these things pretty much anywhere and achieve, something like a modern democracy on the scale of the United States around the world.
So, just to follow up on a few points, you talk about modernization theory as being a product of the 1950s and 1960s of the Cold War period. And obviously, some of the United States' most ambitious programs of nation building have taken place in the post-Cold War period as well. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on the kind of historical context in which modernization theory comes into being within academia, and then how it sort of shifts into the policymaking circles. So there's a lot of ideas in academia that just remain restricted to academia. But I think one thing that you would argue is that modernization theory was not just something that kids studied at university in order to see how modern this country is and how far away from modernity this other country is. But it was something that really sort of came into play in the way that policymakers looked at the world. And although, obviously we're talking about nation building a lot these days in the post-Cold War era, could you just talk a little bit more about that sort of Cold War context?
Sure, absolutely. It's impossible to sort of untie the development of modernization theory from the Marshall Plan in those years in the post World War II reconstruction of Europe, but also areas beyond Europe that received Marshall Plan funds. Part of the reason this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, I think, a bit later. Part of the reason Turkey becomes so central to this is Turkey is a huge recipient of Marshall Plan funds, even though it didn't fight in the war. Right. And so this becomes a real laboratory for modernization theorists, from the jump. So I think if we're going to put modernization theory and nation building in a historical context and in the context of foreign policy, it's important to first understand that, it was a foreign policy creation in so many ways. The policy came first and the theory came later in so many senses. It was an outgrowth of the Marshall Plan and of the early Cold War foreign policy of the United States. And very much was interested in, and they didn't call it nation building back then, but it very much was, what you might think of in your mind as nation building
And
when you hear it today.
just to
Sure.
jump in here quickly, can you just let our listeners know, in case they're not familiar with the term Marshall Plan, what exactly was
Sure.
the Marshall Plan?
So the Marshall Plan, Marshall here is George C. Marshall, implemented this massive reconstruction effort sponsored by the United States across the Allied countries and the non-communist countries in Europe, and then somewhat beyond Europe. Following World War II, it was first enacted in 1947. And continued on throughout the 1950s, provided hundreds of millions of dollars to countries across Europe, and then including Turkey and a few other places, to do all sorts of things in order to reconstruct their national economies, infrastructure, and so on.
Okay, so really modernization theory is almost a response to the Marshall Plan.
In a way, yes. I mean, it kind of comes along with it in so many ways, right? As I said, it's kind of an outgrowth of the Marshall Plan. The idea that the United States is sponsoring the reconstruction of Europe in a democratic and capitalist mold, right, had to come with some kind of empirical study, right, and theory behind it, a social science theory behind it, and this is the what it grows into by the 1950s in a really, really robust way. I think it's important, though, and you asked this question about how we think about nation building in the later Cold War and post-Cold War period. I don't think our conception of nation building is as tied to modernization theory in our minds as it should be. Part of the basic assumption when you think about this, especially in the case of a place like Turkey, is that, the basic assumption is that in order to get to democracy, you have to meet all these laboratory tests first, right? That there's an assumption that certain people or some people simply aren't ready for democracy, right? And we heard this time and time again about Iraqis, about Arabs in other countries throughout the course of the last 25 years. That for some reason, well, I mean, you will hear it in certain circles. You can elaborate the reasons, but for some set of reasons, these countries were not ready for democracy, couldn't handle it, and therefore needed to have strong authoritarian, often dictatorial governments in place in order to modernize the country to a point where maybe sometime way in the future, democracy could flourish, right? So
So
that's how I would define the later half of the question you asked.
So, whereas, for example, in the 19th and early 20th century, the arguments, let's say, Europeans or Americans might put forward regarding sort of their colonial empires and why having colonial empires was okay was kind of based on this racialized idea that people, certain races in the world weren't ready for democracy. Whereas modernization theory is almost a kind of universalist idea, the idea that these people could be ready for democracy. They could be ready for a modern society, but there are these certain benchmarks that they have to reach over that time. So there's nothing inherently impossible about having, for example, Iraqi democracy, but there's certain social, economic, and political things that have to be in place before they can get to that thing. You can't just jump straight to democracy. You have to go through this modernization process. There's no skipping around it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it has this very sort of universalist and very strictly positivistic and empiricist ethos to it, right? Like, complete these 6 steps and then boom, you're ready for democracy, right?
So you've mentioned here a couple of times already Turkey. You are a historian of Turkey by training and trade, and Turkey, interestingly enough, was not a country that was colonized by Europeans during the 19th or 20th century. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Republic of Turkey was established as a sovereign state, but you argue that Turkey and the history of Turkey, especially from the foundation of the Turkish Republic in the 20s right down to the Second World War, was a critical model that modernization theorists looked at, despite it not being a kind of nation-building project in the sense of an external power nation-building. So could you elaborate on that point?
Right. So, I mean, Turkey is central to the development of modernization theory, and for a few reasons. First, I mentioned before that the Marshall Plan, is announced in 1947. On the very same day, actually, that President İsmet İnönü signed the Marshall Plan documents in July 1947, he issued a radio address committing Turkey to a future with 2 democratic parties. And this really inaugurated what's known as the multi-party period in Turkey, their transition from a single-party authoritarian dictatorship into a multi-party democratic system. İnönü's party, quite surprisingly, lost parliamentary elections in 1950, and the opposition party took power peacefully. This surprised the foreign policy establishment in the West and especially in the United States. And it was very, very widely celebrated, among policy circles, among academic circles, and really, drew the interest of a lot of early modernization theorists to study, well, what did they get so right in this context, right? And so many of the early modernization theorists, chief among them, Daniel Lerner from MIT, spent years in Turkey, really, digging into, in this modernization theory framework, what was happening in Turkey? How did Turkey, under the single party, dictatorship of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and after him İsmet İnönü, over the course of 25 years, modernize itself to the point where it could make this transition into democracy. So that that model or that example becomes really, really central for the empirical argument for modernization theory. And in a way, the American foreign policy establishment, when it comes to nation building efforts later on, keeps hunting around for this model. Like, they think, in Saddam Hussein, they've got another Ataturk, or they think in, Anwar Sadat, they've got another Ataturk, or they think they've got, and so on and so forth down the line. And we could talk more about this, but I think that's a critical piece of the story here.
So kind of to jump in here about, you have in Turkey during the 1920s and 1930s the formation of a single party dictatorship that moves towards a democracy. And that model becomes something that the American foreign policy establishment was A, at first surprised at, but B, sort of provides a template of how you get from a kind of authoritarian, quote unquote, society towards a democratic society. And what you seem to be implying here is that, often when we talk about U.S. support for dictators in the Middle East or around the world during the Cold War, it's often seen as kind of just pure power politics, just pure interest. But there's actually a theoretical underpinning to this, that foreign policy establishment types would tolerate perhaps dictators like Anwar Sadat, Saddam Hussein, or the Shah of Iran on the grounds that, well, these societies aren't ready for democracy. And even though these particular dictators look harsh, they're actually preparing the ground for democracy. And I guess you could say that, that was echoed by some of the critics of the Iraq War, who would say, like, don't get rid of Saddam Hussein, because if you do, their society is going to collapse. So Turkey provides a kind of a scheme for how countries can move towards democracy. So even when the United States was supporting dictators, there were people within that foreign policy establishment who would perhaps say that this was a necessary evil because these societies can't just have a democracy. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's how they understood things. Yes, and of course, I should also say that the assumption wasn't just, how do we transition from an authoritarian society to a democratic one, but from a traditional one to a modern one, right? I mean, the title of Lerner's book, which was the basis of, really the seminal text of modernization theory based on his fieldwork in Turkey over the course of almost a decade, was The Passing of Traditional Society, right? Is this binary opposition between modern and traditional, right? But I mean, what I actually argue is that there's a major flaw in using Turkey as an example here, we overlook it on the policy level. We overlook it to great disaster, really, in a lot of cases. The truth is that Turks, going back to the Ottoman period, had moments of real, democratic participation, right? The Ottoman Empire, had a parliament. It wasn't always functional and it wasn't always very democratic, but there were elections in the Ottoman Empire. Even under the authoritarian regime of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, there were local elections in 1930 that included an opposition party. There were broad swaths of society and of elites that were clamoring for democracy and more multi-party democracy throughout the period of the 1920s and 1930s. There were all manner of institutions that were civil society institutions, clubs, groups, the press, and so forth, that function outside of the sort of central command of the state, that really could have tolerated a transition to democracy, I would argue, at any point in the 1920s or 1930s. And critically, the election in 1950, and that period between 1947 and 1950, people forget that even though that this was a celebrated moment of democratic transition, it was also a period of really deep political repression. I mean, Turkey is, keenly aware, Inonu especially in this period, that if they are going to continue to secure Marshall Plan funds for the development of their economy and society and transition to democracy at the same time, the democracy they transition to has to be one friendly to the United States. And so what you get is a version of the same kind of McCarthyism, a Red Scare that you experience, that we experienced here in the United States in that time. And many figures who had even no connection at all to the Soviet Union or to communism or any sort of ideology that would have otherwise been deemed some kind of national security threat to Turkey or the United States, got swept up in this Red Scare. And these were people who had a real role in building a democratic culture in Turkey underneath an authoritarian framework, and they were missing from this entire transition period.
So modernization theory, especially because it drew on this Turkish model of, an authoritarian state dragging, quote unquote, Turks from a traditional society into a modern society. This narrative, which undergirded modernization theory, was actually rooted in a misunderstanding of the history of democratization within Turkey. And so that misunderstanding is replicated in foreign policy circles in terms of both how they understand authoritarian regimes around the world, especially anti-communist authoritarian regimes around the world, and especially perhaps in the post-Cold War era, in how they themselves go about, the United States itself goes about within nation-building projects.
Right. I mean, I think the way to sort of sum up what I try to argue is that it's never really a people broadly that are not ready for democracy. It's elites. And what we saw in Turkey, if you look at the history of development of a democratic culture, time and again, the sort of moments where a transition could have happened, right, or the welcoming of democratic competition could have happened with the formation of the first opposition party in Turkey in 1925, or the next opposition party in 1930. They're shut down and broken off, completely, because elites are quite afraid of their ability to maintain power in a competitive framework, right? It is the people who are central to the party who are afraid for their own necks in a certain way in that scenario, and really do feel like they have an ideological program that needs to be put in place first. They really believe in modernization theory in a sense. Like, I mean, again, there's a very famous saying by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk that part of his goal, and the goal of Kemalism, is to raise Turkey to the level of contemporary civilization, right? It's almost, and he said that before modernization theory even existed, right? And it becomes its ethos in so many ways. It's really, at the end of the day, not peoples who are ready or not ready for democracy, but, do you have political elites who are ready to welcome that kind of competition?
So as a kind of final question to finish off, how have let's say, the wrong lessons of modernization theory, how have they impacted American nation-building efforts in the post-Cold War era? I mentioned at the top here, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think both on the left and the right of the political spectrum in the United States, there's a lot more skepticism towards nation-building. President Donald Trump, for example, recently gave a speech in the Middle East critiquing nation building explicitly. So can you perhaps talk a little bit about how these, let's say, wrong lessons were learned and how they impacted the failure of nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Yeah, I think the basic assumption that in these kind of moments of really political chaos that began with the American invasion, first in Afghanistan in 2001, and then the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and have kind of rippled on from there. The basic assumption that you need some kind of strong hand to guide people in the Middle East, and I think this is, again, I talk about the Middle East because this is my area of specialty, but I think this is applied in other areas of the world as well. The assumption that you need to rely on that strong hand is the main, sort of flaw in this nation building type thinking. And look, in many cases, especially in Iraq, I think a lot of the rhetoric of nation building there was disingenuous in the sense that, it really was a cover for, American companies to come in and profit off of the nation building process, and extract wealth in so many ways. From the Iraqi people at a time when they were incredibly vulnerable. Um, that said, I do think again, to use Iraq as an example, here also was a moment where American advisors were really central in constructing a new constitution and constructing new forms of government that they felt seemed appropriate for a country like Iraq. And again, a lot of this was based on some of the same faulty assumptions that undergirded modernization theory and nation building efforts going back farther. I think in this particular moment, we should be particularly wary of certain changes that are happening throughout the region and keep this in the front of mind. I mean, I think about Syria right now, and what do we actually expect of someone like Ahmed al-Shara in terms of being able to reconstruct a Syrian nation that is more fair to its own people, right? That is more just towards its own people, that is, democratic in so many ways.
Dr. Ryan, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for joining us on Talking History to talk about this important historical topic. And that's all we have time for this month on Talking History, a production brought to you by Missouri State University Department of History and KSMU Radio. You can listen to this episode, as well as our entire back catalog, at ksmu.org or wherever you get your podcasts.